All right. So today I got Alex Ebert with me, and today we're going to talk about negative pragmatism. We've been having this conversation for a while on the IDW and also on Daniel's The Net. So if I'm just trying to recap everything that we kind of brought up, negative pragmatism, the way you kind of interpreted my experience of this, was this sort of okayness with the indeterminacy. But the moment that happens, you go from the indeterminate to the determinate thing.
Well,
And yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so to be okay in a lot of ways, at least my experience with it, to be okay with an indeterminacy, to be okay with confusion, let's just say for the sake of the audience, to experience something confusing. And when we say sometimes I like explaining things, even though your audience may already know perfectly well what indeterminacy means. But to experience something as a confusion means a moment wherein the object, either the idea that you're thinking about, or literally the object itself. Like, for instance, I always, for some reason, use orange, but we can use a glass of water. Somehow no longer represents a glass of water. Suddenly it's, you don't know what it is, and this sounds like something that would never ever happen, but it actually quite happens a lot. For instance, we may encounter a glass of water that doesn't look like your typical glass, and we may be like, what is that? Is that a glass? Maybe it's opaque and we don't know what's in it. And there's just a moment or a flicker where the object is indeterminate. We don't know if it's a vase or a fucking cup or whatever it is, or we saturate the notion of the object so much so that it becomes its own self-relating infinity and thereby becomes indeterminate. And we have all experienced this when we have repeated a word over and over and over and over again until suddenly the word becomes undefinite. And this is also the concept of the mantra. The reason you have to repeat the mantra is because upon first and second and third repetition, the quantitative threshold of saturation is not surpassed, beyond which the word becomes indeterminate. And the point of the mantra is to repeat it to the point of indeterminacy, so that whatever the mantra is, aho nate, is no longer a collection of vowels and consonants. It's now a you don't know what. It is now an indefinicy or an indeterminacy within which you can momentarily reside. And so that, let's just stick with the mantra for a second, because it's a good example of all of the concepts of freak theory in one negatively pragmatic exercise, where the very thing you're driving at or attempting to reach is an indeterminacy itself. It is being witness to the subconscious, which is typically described as a state which is in excess of conscious apprehension. And that the subconscious contains so many relations, so many symbolic relations, that it is effectively potentiated or potentialized. It represents potential as opposed to what is probable or likely. It represents an infinity with respect to the capacity of the conscious mind to cognize it. It's not that it is literally in quote unquote objective reality infinite. Maybe there is no such thing as an objective reality infinity, but with respect to the limitations of a mind that is attempting to grasp something, if that something is in excess of the calculations, the possible calculations of the apparatus attempting to grasp it, then it is effectively rendered infinite, right? Because it cannot be made finite. It cannot be made determinate. So anyway, we take this determinate thing like a word, a mantra, like pony stick, a slightly lewd one, right? And we say pony stick, pony stick, pony stick, pony stick, pony stick, and we haven't yet saturated it, right? There's not enough quantitative repetition yet to reach a threshold, and we never know where that threshold is. But what we're doing is we're taking something that's very pragmatic, two words that mean certain things, and let's say now we're doing a very pragmatic thing, which is because the sort of light cone teleonomy of our desire per death drive is to return to a state of stasis. So a state of what is static. And what is static necessarily is indeterminate, or a state of indeterminacy, because, and I think this is the leap that we always have to make, is that when we're looking for a state of stasis, we're looking for a state of equilibrium which does not change. Now, the ultimate phenomenological state of equilibrium then is where there is no change, phenomenologically speaking. In other words, there is no difference, because attention, if I move from the image of Javier to the computer and back, I've created change, because I'm looking at two determinate items. So that is not the ultimate state of equilibrium. What I would like as an ultimate state of equilibrium, if static drive is real, what it's driving at ultimately is a state in which I can make no differentiation between Javier and my computer, so that I'm not experiencing change. That is real phenomenological stasis. So we tend to think of stasis as in 3 dimensions and as objective, and it's like, okay, the room has a table, a fork and a knife, and negative space, and 4 walls, and so on. But is that static? It's not, if you as the subject can oscillate between table, fork and knife, walls. You're creating difference within the so-called static setting. So a real phenomenological stasis is one in which you cannot create the change between objects any longer, because you cannot tell the difference between objects any longer, because they have become a unitary substance. That's phenomenological stasis. And what we're trying to do when we repeat a mantra is pragmatically now aim at, or you might say like sub-pragmatically or negatively pragmatic, but we'd have to discuss that exactly, because and I think that'll be an interesting topic for us to discuss, is to like get to the bottom of exactly what is negative pragmatism in relation to what I'm describing, and the death which you bring up that it's related to, right? So if the death is aimed at this total phenomenological saturation, which again prevents us or moves us into a space within which we can no longer tell the difference between determinate objects, then we're aiming at, well, before I jump ahead, just to finish this line of thought. So we're aiming at this indeterminacy. And the way to get to this indeterminacy, again, using the mantra as an example, is through some sort of quantitative process that would reveal a quantitative threshold beyond which an interior saturation occurs. A state in which you can no longer determine what one object is in relation to its environment. And again, the mantra is the example. So let's say it's toothpick. Well, at first we know it's toothpick. You pick it. We've had experiences with it. We're creating all sorts of dynamic change within the mind phenomenologically between tooth and pick, and the experiences of a toothpick and so on. And the restaurants we were in, all these determinate oscillations creating difference and change. So that's not a state of stasis. But then we keep repeating toothpick, and we basically congest the very cognitive processes which are capable of creating determinate difference in the first place. We congest it, create an interior saturation, and all of a sudden there's a threshold beyond which the determinations can no longer be made, because the space, the ontological space of toothpick has been saturated to the point of indeterminacy. And that's when the mantra suddenly works. when suddenly it no longer means the determinate meaning you previously assigned to it and that the world had assigned for you and so on, but it means simultaneously everything and nothing, because it is put into a state of potential. So it's quantitatively everything and qualitatively nothing. Right? And that's the state we desire to be in from, let's say, if we're using a mantra, but it's also that indeterminate state, the very premise of drive. So death drive being, or according to Freud, like a return to stasis, or as he uses the term, inert.
Yeah.
But same thing, to be inert is to have inertia, which is to be changeless across time, and to experience no difference. So anyway, drive is moving at this very same thing. So now enter pragmatism and negative pragmatism. The question of pragmatism is so teleologic. It's like, well, I'm being pragmatic in service of something that I am agentially positing as my end goal. I have a goal, I'm conscious of the goal, and now I'm being pragmatic in my approach to that goal, whatever the goal is. And negative pragmatism would almost be to say, what exactly? In relation to, for instance, I'm headed toward this goal, I want this goal. It's almost like, and then I'll hand it over to you because I'm curious. It's almost like negative pragmatism breaks the trance of goal orientation either in one of two ways. One way, it breaks the trance by saying, hey, guess what? What you want is stasis. And simply the act of basically negging the pragmatism or the pragmatist by being like, oh yeah, you're a pragmatist? Did you know that what you're actually after is a state of inertia, like where you're inert, like non-dynamical, like what you equate with death? That's what you're working towards. So it's like to neg the very process to create a problematic which breaks us from the automaticity, the constant automatic hum of prefigured and what's the word I'm looking for? Assimilated interaction, so that the non-thinking, hyper efficient what's the word I'm looking for? Oh Christ! Sorry, what's the word for predictive? Prediction. In a state of pure prediction in which you are encountering the least amount of prediction errors possible, and so on and so forth. So it's either negative pragmatism to grab the reins of prediction error and intentionalize errors so that we can wake up more, because the very premise of predictive mind theory is that we don't actually snap into consciousness. The whole premise of the mind is to make us subconsciously operating at all times so that we're not thinking about anything and expending energy, wasting thinking about things. And it's almost like negative pragmatism could be thought of as the mode which snaps us out of the automaticity of optimized, by the way, and the state of automaticity is, of course, the optimal state to functioning. So snapping out of the optimized rubric and into a suboptimal space where we problematize, snap into consciousness, and can really reform reality from that space. And then the other thing that I wonder if negative pragmatism, and because you've been pointing out, is rather but is more concerned with how do we get out of these states of indeterminacy, because those states are non-dynamical. So how do we leave those states and engender new oscillations of difference, which is to say, to challenge ourselves afresh. So I become the doctor, I become the master. That's like the static state or whatever. And let's just say, or I master language. Well, now what? We'll now try and write poetry or whatever, like think of language afresh. So it could be either that, and this breaks into two parts. It's either breaking from the stasis and into dynamism again, or it's making sure to embrace the deathishness of the indeterminacy by allowing the processes of dialectical differentiation to collapse into indeterminacy, because there's two tendencies. One tendency, and both are basically neurotic, and it's really interesting, but one is to stay within the becoming and not collapse into the indeterminate unity of being, and always just be like, no, I'm always becoming, I'm alive, I'm vital, I'm dynamic, no, I'll be with this woman, but I'll then be with this woman, and I'm not going to settle down because that would represent a collapse of the dynamic interplay between me and sexual otherness, and so on. Now, that can be viewed as a neurotic evasion of death, of non-dynamism, of indeterminacy that you are actually afraid of, or you could collapse into indeterminacy and non-dynamism and want to stay there and be afraid of losing that inert marriage or whatever the thing is, right? The PhD. So in both cases, a negative pragmatism, it's almost like we pathologize pragmatism. Like negative pragmatism basically pathologizes pragmatism. To say that to be pragmatic is to be deluded in one way or the other, whether it's with regard to evading the deathishness of inert arrival and indeterminate being, or it's the fantasy of remaining within that inert unity as if you were really back in the womb and didn't have to engage with the world, which describes in a lot of ways like the fundamentalist position or the emotional agoraphobic or whatever. So anyway, I think I've spoken plenty now. I've taken up too much time, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on all that. I just needed to sort of, it's a new topic for me, as I need to sort of like lay the groundwork for myself more than anything. But anyway.
No, this was good. Yeah, it's funny because I think what's needed for both is a sort of like castration. A sort of it's sort of a it doesn't castration without value really, because you're pointing out that we desire one or the other. It seems people seem to desire one or the other, right? Either I want to be in becoming or I want to be in stasis. What is missing out of both of those values is that castration of possibly being castrated from that desire, you could say. And I've been reading, for some reason last night I cracked open Nietzsche, and I thought this was really interesting because he talked about how to conserve oneself is a sort of way to be non-dogmatic, right? But then there's this interesting move where he talked about in that good and evil kind of book, Beyond Good and Evil, where he says that even when you desire to be detached or whatever, you have to move beyond that too. But then there's this weird thing where it's like you can read Nietzsche as always becoming, but then I would think not, actually. I would think not. If the aim is, to what he says, to be independent or to be this free thinker, free spirit thinker, is to conserve oneself, it's very much in line, I think, with the death drive. I think the question is, people think that perhaps the self, whatever self concept they're working with, they don't allow to be eventually become indeterminate. You could say that the concept of going from stasis to either remaining in stasis or dynamic, they have a concept of self that they enjoy from either end, and they don't wish to engage in any form of like loss or castration of that desire or that point of position that they want to be in. I recently discovered that there's a difference in pop culture with self-care and self-help. And this is very much, ironically, exactly what we're talking about. Self-help is basically being dynamical, right? Always improving and so on towards this goal. And then self-care is basically this idea of preserving oneself as a form of like almost resistance against states of dynamism. um, and I guess you could say negative pragmatism is really interesting in this sense, because there doesn't seem to be a word that captures what is happening between these two states. Everyone seems to prefer one or the other. And I think you've made a great point, Alex, about it's kind of an assumption to assume that the non-dynamic state or the dynamic state is better, which is why I think Nietzsche is actually valuable in this sense, because he's talking about, well, why do we value the non-dynamic state, or why do we value the static state? I mean, why do we value this dynamic state versus the, whatever reason we value one or the other is a good reason to question these states in the first place. But ironically, I think problematizing this is ironically what would get us, what would be a sort of negative pragmatism too. The question is, actually, I'll leave it there to see what has been bringing up for you.
Well, I think, sorry, I had to go outside for a second. I think that what's coming to mind is, just to bring this in the social sphere for a second, in a lot of ways, this comes down to two different archetypes and or two different periods in one's life. Whether those periods are adjacent in decades or moments. And that is preservation and, well, I should say even more basic. It's like it's been sort of delineating between the sloth and the mutant, or coming up with a delineation between. So we obviously are compulsed, and that's the idea of drive and why it's called drive. It doesn't imply that we're driving, it implies something's driving us, and that's the most important aspect of drive, is that this behavior is compulsory. And that is to say that the urge to self-repel from states of stasis and back into that interplay seems to be, and in some ways they answer the question that you've brought it up several times, why some people think that one is sort of ethically superior, and other people think the other is ethically superior, stasis or dynamism, non-dynamic sort of social static states, preserved conservation of states, versus the disruption of states, right? The disruption of social norms versus the traditional preservation of social norms. And largely, when we think about it in those terms, we think of two different kinds of people. We don't simply think of a random assignment where some people really want the preservation of social norms, and other people randomly want the destruction of those social norms and the engagement with a dynamic reinvention. And Instead, we see the disruptors as very particular type, and then we see the preservers as another particular type, and there's an almost archetypal aspect to those who want to sort of preserve versus those that don't. But as you point out, um, to be an individual is to preserve the static identity of a unity. It just so happens that unity is at the scale of the individual. And so I'm always reminding myself and others to think of scale. Whenever we think of the dialectic and these collapses, and it's always implied whenever I bring up interiority and exteriority, interior and exterior, scale is always implied because every exterior is itself an interior to something else at a larger scale. So you have the individual, that's one scale of interior, but then if you zoom out, the individual is part of some clique, or they're part of a family, or they have a relationship, and so that there's another interior. Now, these interiorities aren't necessarily equally saturated or anything. For instance, they may just be sort of containers that haven't reached saturation, where the limit is yet to be revealed, and thereby the interiority of that relationship yet to be affirmed or reified. But you have the fervor of a religion, you have the fervor, the saturated interior of a stadium full of fans. You have these momentary interiors that are popping up and then dissipate all the time. So anyway, the individual who represents, in a lot of ways, the rebellious individual is never rebelling against their own unity. What they're doing is claiming a unity so idiosyncratically different that it is in direct conflict with society in some way. And the identity thereby of like the rebel is, of course, incredibly fixed, right? Incredibly non-dynamic. And yet what they're trying to effectuate is a new dynamic interplay within the world. It just so happens that this time the dynamic interplay is actually themselves with the world, like the one unity against another unity. And so you have these, I suppose in a way what Sloterdijk would call spheres of dialectical interplay, and they scale up and create all sorts, a whole variety of interiors for us that we get to experience, and interiors within our interior, of course, like bacteria and so on. There's so much going on within us that we're playing host to. So, but anyway, that all came to mind. And oh, and there's something else I wanted to say, which was about I might not be able to remember at the moment. Yeah. Anyhow, I guess the only thing the thing I guess I wanted to double tap on, it's always helpful doing these rhetorical inversions, even if we could say, well, let's just redefine pragmatism. It's like, yeah, we could do that. And that can be helpful, like a rhetorical inversion, but also just putting negative pragmatism is one of those things that's so deeply baked as inherently positive that you kind of have to add the neg before it. And I think, oh, this is what I wanted to bring up. And it irks me, but it irks me mostly. If I lived in the East, it would irk me in the opposite sense. But it irks me because I live in the West, that most people I know are of the archetypical type, which is for dynamism, and which is ethically prioritizes dynamism as inherently superior, inherently courageous, and ethically and politically more advanced. And I hear it all the time. Stay with the tension. Yeah, man, stay with the tension. Be brave. Now, it makes sense, but if we're staying with the tension and, quote, being brave, in order to avoid a collapse into unity, that is itself pathological, because the collapse of unity isn't inherently a bad thing just because it's non-dynamical. Death is non-dynamical. Is death a bad thing? Is death not the portal of rebirth that engenders the ongoing cornucopia of life? You know, of course it is. So it almost seems that we're living in the West, where we're afraid of death and we're neurotically projecting that fear into projects, what Becker would call immortality projects, which are all these neurotic projects to try and make us feel like we're immortalizing ourselves in some sense. And by the way, when I say immortalizing, again, all I mean are these interior saturations that are static designations. Doctor, just even achieving that. Rock star, philosopher, I am this. I can describe it as a platonic, static form, and thereby project myself into it, my identity, and I am now eternalized and thereby immortalized, and somehow have eluded this thing that I'm really afraid of, you know. So anyway, so whenever I hear the classic stick with the contradictions, how do we stay dynamic, as if there's sort of a blind spot there, is really what it is, where the dynamism, the lionizing of dynamism against non-dynamic, static, inert states, may be more telling of the culture within which a philosophy is being thought than it does the value of that position in the first place. Because the reality is that even having a hard-lined view that dynamism is better than non-dynamism is itself to have a non-dynamical point of view, which refuses change. So we're constantly relying on non-dynamic shit to even formulate our ideas or to even think. And yet we're constantly railing against dynamism. So I think that's maybe a function of Western sort of capitalistic, go, extractive, self-extractive, self-pimping behavior.
Yeah, I was gonna point that out, that that to actually be dynamic would actually to be involved the non-dynamic state. That's the paradox there,
Right.
right? Like you cannot say that this is the same critique I have about people that say they're open-minded, and they advertise for everybody to be open-minded. But the one thing that they're not open-minded for is people that are not open-minded. So it's like, are you actually open-minded if there's this one part that you can't be open-minded for, which is people that are not open-minded? You know?
Exactly. And you know, yeah, and it's almost like negative pragmatism then in that sense is the sub-optimization of the process which will get you wherever you think you're supposed to go, or a suboptimal approach to I should say it results in a optimal approach. Really, what we're talking about is precisely what we're talking about. To talk about what we're talking about is the art of negative pragmatism. To consider that every position you hold, every goal you hold as dear to you, everything motivating you, is itself subjectable to a form of critical thinking which jeopardizes the goal, or jeopardizes the goal as a finality worth driving at in the first place. And I like this because at first it seems nihilistic, but when you neutralize an aim out of its automaticity, because at first, obviously, it's automatic. You're not thinking about why you want this thing. You just know you want it. And ooh, that makes it really mysterious. And ooh, that makes it, that sort of qualifies it as a genuine desire, a genuine urge. The genuine urges are the ones you can't explain. The genuine loves are the ones you can't explain. You just love them, you know, and that's the sort of approach that we take. But to actually uncloth that and denude it down to like, okay, no, what is it that you actually love about this thing? And then to realize and to walk through the attainment of that thing before attaining and be like, and then what? There's a game I love to play called And Then What? I need this thing. Okay, and then what? And then this happens. Okay, and then what? Right? And then eventually and then what? The answer eventually has to say, and then I die.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
So I find that helpful because it gets us to the to this neutral point where we realize that the attainment of whatever it is doesn't do the evading that we think it might. And then from that neutralized state, we can be like, okay, do I still want that thing? Now that I know all this. And that's the only point at which we would be making an agential decision about any pragmatic goal. And that, I think, would be negative pragmatism, and not the opposite of pragmatism, but like inverted process pragmatism, like the I don't even know exactly how to describe the prefix of negative there, but I think that there's a use for it. But anyway, I like the idea of doing all that and leaving yourself with the ability to make an agential pragmatic choice with it, which itself does seem to be a negative pragmatism, where pragmatism is within the domain of automaticity, and negative pragmatism is a true choice toward one thing or the other. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, I think you're getting at what Daniel Garner always talks about, the absolute choice.
Yeah.
And I think negative pragmatism is probably what helps us get there, as what you're saying, which is where when we realize that there is essentially no escaping from whatever you're trying to do, or whatever you're trying to supposedly aim at, or better in your words, it's impossible to evade. We can't evade whatever we're attempting to evade in the pursuit that we're attempting to do. And so in that sense, we realize that this choice is merely what it is, an actual pure choice. We don't need to customize it. If say what you've been saying, but we add the extra shit because we don't realize that it merely is what it is, meaning a choice that we've made. But we like to think, and I think this is the part where you were telling me about, like the pragmatic, you said this in IDW, maybe you can reinstate this. The pragmatic part is mistakes the confusion, right, as something else, right?
Mistakes potential for
Yes.
mistakes potential for confusion, and
Hmm.
the negative pragmatist takes confusion to be potential. The pragmatist takes potential to be confusion, and the negative pragmatist takes confusion to be potential.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, I like that. I do like that. I think that's helpful. I mean, I also think though that negative pragmatism has a fun connotation where you sort of literally are uh, doing things that are essentially sabotaging a given desire. It's kind of like what I used to refer to as status burning, or status burning could be an example of a negative pragmatic
Hmm.
activity,
Hmm.
because the beautiful feeling, if you have some status to burn, if you're not like at the end of on the very outskirts of the interiority, then it's an amazing thing. It's really liberating to sort of burn status. And I wonder if the same is true with, like, for instance, wouldn't it be fun? Maybe we should do, oh, this would be kind of interesting as a negative pragmatic sort of weekly or monthly, the bad philosophy, like bad philosophy. And we intentionally get together on a Zoom and do bad philosophy, as like we do philosophy as poorly as possible.
Hmm.
Mm, I don't even know what that would yield, but I mean, an example with musicians is like, okay, if you need to change things up, it's like if you had a director there, they'd be like, and I think it would be a brilliant way to direct an actor in a movie too, especially if they're having trouble. To be like, okay, on this take, I want you to do it as bad as possible. I want you to act as poorly as you can. Whatever that is, the worst actor you can think of, or the worst musician you can think of. I want you to play guitar um, like you have zero coordination. And the thing is that those sort of activities really like shake everything off, uh, uh, and really help to sort of obviously get rid of nerves and so on. But more than that, there's something simply about breaking the automaticity
Hmm. Hmm.
that wakes you up to potential itself, like where you create a rupture, and that rupture breaks the brain for a moment, and that moment reminds you of potentiality and all the different many ways to do things and so on. So it's almost like there's a vital energy there. It's almost beyond schematization. It's just that moment literally contains force and power and so on. And so just to be negatively pragmatic for a moment is to sort of revitalize, um, even if it's just used as a tool. So I think I think it's helpful in so many ways.
Yeah, I had a Chiton kind of describe to me this the idea of like the repetition, and that negative pragmatism would almost be like taking the scenic route versus the optimized route of getting to the house or whatever. And it's funny when you want to take like a scenic route, we don't actually enjoy taking scenic routes that often, mainly because it's a like why. It's always followed up with a why. Why would you take this way versus just going straight there? Um, and what I like about this idea of like doing bad philosophy, like on purpose, would be almost like, let's take the scenic route. And I think
Well,
what's neat
yeah,
about doing bad philosophy, right, would be that one, we're assuming what is bad philosophy. This would, and it would actually result in kind of being funny, actually. Like I would imagine that if we all got together and practiced and said what we thought was bad philosophy, I think it would actually be pretty funny.
It'd be funny, and it would also probably, you know, yeah, I've like life hacks and taking the scenic route and all of that. But also, I've described this thing called, depth scaffolding, uh,
Mhm,
and in the suboptimal essay, and I really do think I do think that this is the case. I think that human depth, what we take to be human, especially philosophical depth, but human depth is an artifact of suboptimal processes. The more we optimize our anything, philosophies, whatever they are, the less depth they actually have. And and optimize them for consumption is what I mean. So the meme is, very compressed piece of information and so on. But the idea that human depth is created by suboptimal relationship to information is so true. If we think about it, like, we needed to invent gods and immense beautiful narratives to explain rain. We just simply didn't know why it fucking rained. So we come up with a rain god, and there's a story about this and a story about that. Now, we don't know what gravity is. So some philosopher comes up with a whole fucking philosophy about gravity. And it turns out there's these little gravitons, and they work together, and at a certain depth of saturation, they pull on things, and that pulling is a return to the unit. Nah, I'm just making shit up at this point, because I'm pretending I don't know what gravity is. So I'm forced to come up with an explanation that is creative. And all of these creative explanations, like you think about, well, why is some philosophy so opaque? Why is it so difficult to grasp? Why are they using these words and those words? Well, because they didn't know what they were talking about. So they had to figure out what they were talking about. Like there's a real beautiful layer of like granularity to ignorance.
mhm,
Because when you're truly ignorant, you have to get truly creative about orienting yourself to the world. If not everything is readily apparent, you have to fill in blanks in interesting ways. And the moon is made of cheese and so on. And so all of these seeming ignorances really produced the array of human depth, or what we think of as sort of intellectual depth,
mhm,
which is really just a certain level of opacity that is being mediated by ignorance, and we're grasping for ways to describe things.
mhm,
And so in that grasping, there's a reaching for language that we otherwise wouldn't need. There's a reaching for the ineffable, because we don't quite know what we're talking about. And what we're even trying to inspire in the reader or in the listener is a sense of the ineffable, the unknown, the unknowing, the
mhm,
the indeterminacy. And the more we optimize those processes, obviously, the less we need any of that, description, because we realize, oh, actually, it's just this. It's just
mhm,
this thing and that thing and that thing, and so on, and um, and it all becomes really, really, really pat. Like the sort of schematic of information, or the topology of information becomes just sort of like a ticker, and um, and at that point, we don't really experience human depth. So when we say we're going to do bad philosophy and it'll be funny, well, it definitely probably be very, but
yeah,
but what would also probably be is far more creative,
yes, yes,
because bad philosophy is ungrounded, unfounded. Certainly does discards a lot of science, right? Bad philosophy would not think about science all that much, right? Bad philosophy would be an emotional philosophy also, right? We'd produce philosophies based on how we felt. So there's an ignorance, a whole world of ignorance there, and so on. And bad philosophy might be classically childish, and so on. So, and yet, from that exercise, I would guarantee you there would be some genius shit in there that we wouldn't have otherwise ever come across, because we would have been too concerned with optimizing the philosophical process that we use to come up with very serious and reputable and impactful and philosophies that aren't fully wasting their time in a circle jerk of philosophical reverie, but are, things that will really contribute to the canon of philosophy and so on. And by putting those pressures on us, we're, minimizing free energy, economizing our philosophical inquiry, optimizing the process of philosophy, getting rid of extraneous shit, and thereby getting rid of the scenic route. What's the most robust, perfect way I can say this to that? And you're always encouraged in writing classes and so on, and everyone will tell you, find out what you want to say and write it as if you're explaining to a 5-year-old. What they're telling you to do is, don't take the fucking scenic route verbally. Get on the freeway, get on that highway, write the thing, get it done, get from one sentence to the next, make your point, be Hemingway, neat, tight, that's it. That's all you got to do. Now you're optimizing communication, optimizing writing. So we're constantly constricting that process and getting away from the scenic route. And yet in the scenic route are just untold gems. And we just won't know about them if we don't allow ourselves to explore them. So in a lot of ways, negative pragmatism in the context of philosophy is taking that scenic route, which would be, to say in a fun way, doing bad philosophy.
Yeah. No, I love that. I love that it took kind of like constantly talking about negative pragmatism to get to a part that I'm starting to really enjoy what you're bringing up here, like doing bad philosophy. Because even the assumption of what is bad philosophy, it's just too much of a concern that we already avoid because we already consider it bad philosophy without exploring it. Right? It's sort of like a given what bad philosophy looks like versus actually doing it. What is actual bad philosophy when we're actually doing it versus saying what we think is bad philosophy? And what could come out of that creative process when we're doing that? Because we could even be like even more of like we could realize what would be funny, and also what would come out creative is that we would identify people that are not doing bad philosophy enough. Like it would still be a good philosophy, but it would be funny because it would be like, oh, so that's actually what you think is a bad philosophy.
Right. Yeah, no, this is bad.
Yeah, this is bad. Yeah, this is worse. I'm going to give you a worse one. Right?
Worst philosopher. I mean, I think it's true though, because like, if you were to like be a bad philosopher right now, go, I'd be like, I'd start breaking all my own rules, and it would be quite beautiful. You know what I mean? And I think that in some ways is the most fun and useful, or at least intelligible aspect, like on a sort of pedestrian level, of negative pragmatism. It's like whatever state you're in, it doesn't matter if you're in the neurotic adherence to dynamism or the neurotic adherence to non-dynamism. Either way, you'll benefit from shaking either of those up. And the reality is that most of us are neurotic in some sense, clinging in some sense, and that process is totally natural, but that the real courage doesn't lie with one camp or the other, but lies in either a subject in either position, to recognize that whatever process they're engaged in, they're in some sense clinging to its repetition, and afraid of the ending, and there's some neurosis there, and I think just that negative pragmatic tool as a mode to constantly confront, question, stress test, whatever process you're in, or simply as a mode of invention, which is really what it is. It's a mode, like whatever state you're in, even if it's unconventional, you've created a convention from the non-conventional state, where you're now afraid to not look like a really interesting queer hipster, because you're now known as that. And so what is that? It is the conformity of nonconformity. It's the state of I have to be interesting. And I have to hang out with other people who look interesting. And so we all end up looking the same way because we're all being interesting in relative to the otherness. And so that when we allow a negative pragmatism, it requires us to break from the dominant form of our present allegiances. And I think that's just so, it's like what we're all after, right? It's like, what is the practice that will make me sort of which will surprise me about myself, and which will create new possibility? What will tap into my potential? Like, what will tap into your potential is the disruption of whatever it is you're doing, and the confrontation with an indeterminacy, because potential and indeterminacy are the same phenomenological experience. And so it's whenever we get shook out of a current habit that we get to encounter that potentiality, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways it's almost very Nietzschean a little bit. And it's what's interesting about this is that when we look back at Nietzsche, and he was talking about we need to avoid being these masses, this average man or whatever. It's funny because now individualism is sort of the most massive thing that you could do, right? The most common average thing you could do: be individual, be interesting, be your own particular self. And it's kind of fucking hilarious now because then to perhaps be the most uninteresting person would actually be to be against that, ironically. And then yet that could collapse into a kind of, like you said, non-conventional convention, and then stir that shit up again. And it makes me think that actually to be Nietzsche's quote individual is actually not to be fixated on the term itself, but actually this very oscillation, this constant disruption of basically preventing yourself from enjoying a sort of self-identical position that you have chosen. I am so interesting, so I have to remain interesting, or I'm actually very uninteresting, so I have to remain uninteresting. This kind of disrupting what it means, it almost puts to the question of perhaps negative pragmatism when it comes to the idea of the self, is that you actually have no idea what the fuck it is, and actually to just allow the disruption to happen, or you could say make the disruption happen, because if you make the disruption happen, you could actually encounter what it means to be this so-called self. But because everybody has an idea of what this self is supposed to be and mean, I mean, at least very obvious that we seem to look for it, self-help, finding yourself, etc. Or we're very sure of who we are. That's another problem sometimes. So there's two archetypes there, where it's like there's the one constantly trying to figure out who they are, and then there's the one that knows who they are. And to me, those ironically become very static states in terms of just its own self-identical um, position. I am this. I am still searching for this. I am a man still searching. Like that is already identifying within yourself something that is indefinite. But then just being the disruptor of both those positions, in which ironically creates depth, which you are alluding to. And I think negative pragmatism, which is so a good way of framing this, is that this is why it isn't nihilistic, though. It's because it creates depth. It's precisely because it creates depth that it isn't nihilistic. You could say nihilism is when you have got to the optimal state and you said, well, what then? What then? Right? And the guy's like, well, nothing left. There's nothing left. There's always going to be a what then. So there's no point. But the ironic part of creating a sort of scenic route creates depth, creates possibly more meaningful relationships, but not meaningful in the sense of which we would have anticipated.
Yeah.
That's the part that you could have not anticipated what depth you were looking for, but letting the disruption or creating the disruption, whatever way we want to talk about it, creates depth in not only relationships, but in relation to yourself and the world, which is something that you would have never anticipated. It's precisely because pragmatism is always anticipating better relationships, a better self, etc.
Yeah. Yeah, I like it. And again, and it sort of crystallizes that the negative pragmatist is the one who takes confusion as potential.
Mm-hmm.
And the pragmatist takes potential as confusion, or as confusion, and thereby bad. It's like everyone trying to solve the meaning crisis is a pragmatist, and those who see the those who see the confusion as potential are the negative pragmatists, and yeah, because ultimately it probably is. Let's not kid ourselves. The negative pragmatism may not at all delay the inevitable non-dynamical collapse into a unitary trait. In fact, the negative pragmatist may expedite that process by being so goddamn wise about everything. But either way, the reality is, like, let's say that I want to make an amazing album, and I hear this is how you do it. If I just follow pragmatically those steps, I'm unlikely to succeed, because I'm unlikely to produce anything that feels fresh or like it has the energy of potential. So ironically, the thing I have to do is the very thing that would go against all of those things, or at least do a few of those moments. And so that, in the same way that, I don't know who said it, but it's like the fastest way to enlightenment is to become a heroin addict. All of these contrary things, like to get to such a bottom, to become such a fuck up, that you need the spiritual process or whatever, so that you can become a really earnest devotee. Because how are you going to get that earnestness unless your life is in shambles? And so, a very negative pragmatic move is to make sure your heart gets broken and bad. These sorts of things, when the teleonomics of desire are pointing in the direction of really the highest orders of personal achievement, then all of a sudden you really have to be negatively pragmatic, otherwise you won't get there. You have to have had your heart broken, and so on. You have to have experienced, for instance, extreme status loss. I mean, that's why you always have those stories, the prince who becomes a pauper to Buddha and so on, because those are you can say, you know, I am an everyman. Money means nothing to me. But unless you've actually lost your money, you really don't know if what you're saying is true or not. You know, so you need these modes of negative pragmatism to act as crucibles, and yeah, I mean, yeah, it brings up all sorts of interesting spiritual things as well, like you know, the idea of a society that does not, that actually allows for people to talk about their shadow shit in public in a way that is non-cancelable, where we all sort of show up for one another and we're like, oh yeah, fuck, yo, I've been shit too, or whatever, and actually risk the status in a way that doesn't risk the status. That would be sort of like taking negative pragmatism to its logical conclusion, in which the world is negatively pragmatic. And then at which point, you know, it's like failure is recognized as being the peak, which is the plateau, which everyone knows is the plateau, and that failure is success. It's just success after it plateaus. It's the flat ground of the highest plateau, and you know, upon which you build the next mountain. So anyway, I always think it'd be fun to live in a society like that, because that might be the one sort of society that I wouldn't rebel against, you know. Yeah, although, you know, never, you know, maybe I'd be one of those guys who was like, okay, I need to rebel so compulsively bad that I'm going to become a conservative, so that, you know, you see that happening a lot right now.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've heard of like this combination of like MAGA and communism, which I think is interesting. That's been happening. Yeah, MAGA and communism, man. Apparently I don't know if you follow like Daniel Tutt, but he had a conversation with a guy that he's basically moving in that direction. It was a debate, but they're basically MAGA communist guys, which I just found fucking fascinating because it was just like.
I mean, that makes sense. Nationalism. I mean, you know, it's funny the way things are headed, but yeah, we're headed. We're basically in a state where everyone's like, oh, wait a minute. Even the left is like differentiating like mad. I mean, they're coming up with new categories whenever they want to, which is just a mode of differentiation. And then the right is differentiating, and basically all, you know, it's just turning into a retribalization, which is what everyone predicted would happen anyway. And the reinstitution of difference. Apparently, we ended up in a highly sublated, equalized, sufficiently equalized to surpass some threshold beyond which people were like, actually, you know what? Fuck this. Let's retribalize. And that's basically, you know, what we're seeing. Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, I generally love the negative pragmatism, and you know, I used to practice it a lot with my band. You're supposed to have set lists. You're supposed to go out on stage and know what you're going to sing and play and so on. And I would intentionally, we wouldn't have a set list. The band would ask, right, when we were doing our huddle before going on stage, what song are we playing first? And I'd say, I don't know. And so they would all get really annoyed because there's different tunings for different songs. There's different settings for different songs. There's different instruments for different songs. So they'd walk out on stage not knowing what fucking instrument to pick up or exactly what to do. So it'd make everything really ragtag. And I'd go out there and I'd talk to the audience for a second, and then I'd call a song, and then they'd all have to like figure out how to get the song going. And my manager would be like, you know, this is just, you know, this is like, sometimes this is cool, but this is also fucking us up. Like, we got to be way more slick if we want to get to like the higher levels. And I was just like, nah, this is the highest level. because what happens is what you forfeit in optimized form, you gain, or at least the gamble is, once in a while you get these nuggets that could not have ever happened
Yeah.
had you not created the conditions for potential. So basically what people thought was confusion was me seeding the grounds for potential. And they would sprout, these moments of potential would sprout, and they'd be magnificent, and they made everything worth it. But yeah, so this is all this the suboptimal or negative pragmatism has always been important to me, and part of that negative pragmatic gamble is like, yeah, you forfeit a lot, but what you potentially gain in that gamble is unquantifiably greater than what you would have otherwise had. So yeah,
It's
I also think there's a negative pragmatism to you asked. I think you didn't you pose the question about reading?
yeah, I did.
I think, like, the most pragmatic approach to philosophy, obviously, is to read as much as possible so that you don't develop redundant theories, and then you work and spin off of others. You be inspired, keep notes, and don't invent the wheel twice. But you forfeit quite a lot with that approach. And I think what you forfeit is your own creativity again. Because if you're ignorant, remember, you're more likely to be creative. Right? So if you allow yourself to remain in pockets of ignorance, to be able to develop things, use the creativity, extract whatever creativity you can out of your ignorance, then take the results of that creativity and compare them against existing philosophies and see what matches up, and then begin reading, and really, and then get inspired and go back into the sandpit, of ignorance, where you don't be like, oh, I guess this, well, then now let me just do all the research in the world, figure out everything about this topic, and then spin everything off of that. Unless you're in a field where, like, there are repeatable scientific experiments that have proven a certain thing, and you don't want to be that fucking ignorant, but if we're talking about philosophy or anything that's spinning off of existent or extant facts, once you have those basic facts, I think that the negative pragmatic approach that I like to philosophy is where you do allow yourself the space of ignorance so that you can trigger your own creativity to solve things in an interesting and idiosyncratic and novel way, and then take the products of that, compare them against philosophy, and then modulate them and or improve them accordingly. And one of the great bits about that is that you get to see confirmation of your instincts in the work of others. And that's how you sort of ping pong your way down the alleys of affirmation and modulation and mutation and so on, where you grow your own philosophy, and all these people that are like, don't do that, that's selfish, that's ego, to fuck those, like that is too suppressive of the brilliance of each and every person's idiosyncratic mind. But the idiosyncratic creativity can only be triggered in a state of ignorance. There has to be some mystery that allows for your own creativity. Otherwise, everything you're going to input is an already stated fact. And that's cool. You can create combinations, but you won't even know how to create those combinations, again, relate to a given ignorance. Because if every combination has already been figured out and there's a product associated with every combination, then there are no recombinations left, but the only thing that would embark us on any process of recombination is if there is some ignorance, if there's something we don't know. And so this the importance of ignorance is fundamental to creativity. And it's like necessity is the mother of invention. The grand necessity is information, and a necessity of information, right?
Mhm.
Is the mother of invention. So anyway, yeah, all that to say that again, I just think that negative pragmatism is a really powerful little phrase, and obviously inspiring.
You know, the the way you're framing this like ignorance part, it's like the way Nietzsche describes it. The will to knowledge is the will to ignorance. but but it's but the way you're promoting it, the way you're talking about it, is actually by, so the way Nietzsche diagnoses everybody else is by saying that our will to knowledge is fundamentally grounded in the will to ignorance. And so what we're doing is we're breaking the automaticity of our will to knowledge and bringing forth the will to ignorance as an active process versus an automaticity, which is a very interesting switch, because that is exactly how knowledge and how creativity would come about, and that is also how depth would come about. And I think it actually reminds me why fucking philosophers always talk about poetry. They always talk about poetry because poetry, for some damn reason, always has a sort of unsayable depth to it.
Yeah, and just to double tap on that, the problematicity, in contrast to automaticity, is not so much the determinate problem. Okay, this and that don't match. It's the space in between the problem. It's the ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
The indeterminacy is the problem,
Mm-hmm.
because it hasn't yet been determined. That's all. And so, that state of problematicity is actually that state that draws forth our creativity to fill in the blanks. And that's why poetry is so beautiful, and what separates it and differentiates it from prose is simply that it has more gaps in it than prose. So it has more of an invitation for the reader, or a requirement really for the reader, to fill in blanks. And the poetry is that which requires the reader to be more creative, because the gaps are just so much more vast. Haikus are great examples of that. But I think we love that as philosophers, like you said, because there's a greater space of problematicity, indeterminacy, and therefore creativity, and therefore the greater invitation to think.
Mm-hmm. I think this is also why people loved. For some reason, I've noticed there's something neurotic when people talk about Nietzsche, which is they always feel like their interpretation of Nietzsche is correct. Um, but I always think that Nietzsche is the type of guy that ironically did create that space of ignorance to happen with his plethora of aphorisms and sort of just like just really just kind of different way of talking about philosophy, really, which is just so interesting. And I always think, like, why is every philosopher so obsessed with Nietzsche? Like, they all have to give a fucking explanation about him, but I understand the attractiveness to it because there is a depth that's like, well, shit, what is he trying to say here? Heidegger did an interpretation, everybody's trying to give an interpretation of Nietzsche, but I think that's why I think the negative pragmatist position is so interesting when even looking at someone like Nietzsche, is
I
because
agree. I mean, I think it's a negative, it's a weird child. I mean, think of the move of writing down your philosophy as a novel, or or coming up with the 3 stages of life and calling them uh
camel.
the lion, the camel, and the child. Like, the camel, like, what the fuck? That's like plucked out of a hat. It means nothing. I mean, yeah, sure, you'll carry the world on your back and so on, but like, you could have used anything.
Yeah.
But it's there's a lot of sort of like, also there's a lot of his own, he's getting out a lot of his fucking like creative yayas just in the way that he's writing, and so on. And so he's breaking a lot of the rules. He's like, the fucking whatever, the like William Burroughs of fucking philosophy. And 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 of course that's going to be interesting and compelling in its own right. It's like, holy shit, this is a revelation. You know, and also his inversion of a lot of ideas, like his notion of masks being more truthful than what's behind the mask and so on. And you know, there's just a lot of his approach to life was very anti-pragmatic, um, and his writing was very non-pragmatic. But then again, so was Hegel's.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, Hegel's writing is almost impenetrable, and so talk about uh, zero pragmatism in a consumer from a consumer standpoint. But then again, maybe it was very pragmatic. I mean, again, the Hegel is a great example of a negative pragmatism producing depth, because he could have described all that 10, if you waited 20 years for sinusoidal waves to come out, he could have described the dialectic in, you know, a couple pages. Um, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But instead, he doesn't have the language to describe the real numbers, for instance. And the real numbers weren't a thing until 10, 15 years later. He didn't have set theory. That wouldn't be developed for another 50 years. But if he had all those things, he wouldn't have had to write The Science of Logic. Would have been a fucking essay. It wouldn't have been a book. And, you know, it would have been like a white paper. So, like, but because he didn't have any of that stuff, he ended up laying down this incredibly beautiful Bible of thought, that is, in its own right, a piece of art, a piece of depth. And at the end of the day, you know, as philosophers, we be kidding ourselves, and we're like, what we're really interested in is the truth. Well, sure, but we're also really interested in friendship.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, that's why, you know, a lot of us actually are like, hey, you want to do a Zoom? Because we maybe it's like we just really want someone to talk to about our ideas that will actually understand what the fuck we're saying for a second. You know, there are all sorts of reasons why we do what we do, and definitely creating, indulging in otherwise opaque works of art, getting to know them. There's something rewarding on a level that is ineffable, because there's a depth excavation going on that has its own value, and in a very sort of like capitalistic, economizing time paradigm, it would seem that we're wasting our time, right? And there's a lot of people that we interact with who think that philosophy on the level of Hegel or something like that, especially, is a total waste of time, gobbledygook. You can either, you know, it's just status signaling.
Mm-hmm.
But for those of us who understand or appreciate depth, yes, you can say certain things. And in a lot of ways, freak theory is an example of explaining the dialectic in a single meme.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an advancement and a sort of a collapsing of the Hegelian dialectic into a meme, which of course is going to have a lot of information loss, and a lot of depth will be lost. But ideally, we create these memes in such a way that when you unpack them and you get into them, the depth sort of like re-reveals itself, kind of like one of those exploding, you know, sponge monkeys that your child gets and puts in the bath, and they turn into the animal. Ideally, memes re-expand and present some aspects of the depth. But anyway, yeah, I think that the philosophy in the end then is sort of like this process of negative pragmatism, which then inevitably has some pragmatic end, which is the product, which is necessarily informationally collapsed, even if you don't want it to be, right? Hegel
Mm-hmm.
writes these volumes and volumes of negative pragmatic prose, and then he doesn't even have to do the collapsing. The people fucking reading him collapse it for him, and say, oh, the dialectic is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And he's like, wait a minute, that's not even what I said. They're like, too bad, bro. You should have, you know what you should have done? you should have been a little more pragmatic and let us know on the fucking introduction. If you're going to synthesize and compress this book, please compress it in the following way. And that's actually something that I'm very aware of, is being pragmatic with regard to the inevitability of informational collapse, which would be, in Hegelian terms, the sublation of your own philosophy, which will happen, which simply will happen. You can't avoid that. And yeah, and I think Nietzsche may have should have done a little bit of that himself, with regard to, you know, creating mimetic, informationally collapsed and condensed versions or aphorisms of his own philosophy that wouldn't have so easily lent themselves to Nazi adoption. Because what the Nazis were able to do was consolidate Nietzschean philosophy, because Nietzsche failed to do that himself. And, you know, as philosophers, we don't want to do that because we'd like to stay really ambivalent and I mean, not ambivalent, but indeterminate in a certain sense, because it retains our poetic aura. You know, if you could collapse me into a sentence like I've lost my status as a magician. So we would prefer not to, but I think it's sort of irresponsible, because it presumes falsely that history doesn't itself collapse you into a unitary determinate form. And we just have to recognize that's simply the inexorable move of the dialectic, and we're going to be collapsed as people, as husbands, as friends, as people you encounter on the street. Everyone collapses you, and that's the basic premise of the you know, of the quantum classical dynamic, where we're in a quantum wave state, and then upon observation, we are collapsed into a determinate form that does not actually represent the totality of our being, because the totality of our being is occupying many states at once, which is to say, indeterminate. We are indeterminate, but you're making me determinate by simply interacting with me. And this is the conundrum, right? So if we're going to be seen as determinate, we might as well take up the fucking mask, pretending real. As well tell, okay, fine. If you're going to mask, you know, this is who I am. Anyhow, I have to take a pee break, I'm afraid.
Oh yeah, you're good. I think we could probably start wrapping it up now. Yeah, so I like this idea of the mask as such, and ironically, it's the mask that sort of creates depth here. And I like even thinking of the.
Sorry, I'll be right back. I do have to leave in about 15 minutes.
Yep, same here.
All right, I'm back. You still there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So let me just If you could recap what you said about the mask, because I think you cut off on that part.
Oh, just to say that let's just call it the observer effect, in line with physics. If the observer collapses the wave function of a particle or the wave function of a person, right? When not being observed, you're sort of this indeterminate whatever, and then upon observation, and then upon observation or upon cognization, you're collapsed into Javier, right? And you were sort of otherwise in this potential state, but the act of observation, and in some ways philosophically the act of thinking, collapses what was otherwise indeterminate in the realm of the subconscious into a conscious determinate item like flower. So anyway, so then Nietzsche is sort of like, that is in an interesting move, and this is maybe off topic, but he says that the mask, which is obviously the thing, the observed determinate form, contains the how do I say this? I wrote a whole paper on this, and now I'm sort of like struggling to describe it. I guess I'd have to reference the paper again, but basically, the metaphysics is the metaphysics of masks, and either that is attributed to Nietzsche, that line, or that is attributed to Oscar Wilde. In either event, Oscar Wilde and Nietzsche were very much on the same page with regard to masks, and that in essence, the mask is not some superficiality, but is sort of the language of the profound. All that is profound loves a mask. That's Nietzsche.
Yep, that's Nietzsche. Yep.
And I would take that a step further and to say all that is profound requires a mask, in the same sense that you cannot get to the state of profundity being the state of indeterminacy, right? Profound, that which is profound exceeds schematization and cognization. We cannot quite quantify what is profound. It is a qualitative thing. The only way to get to a state of which exceeds our ability to cognize it is to have a limit on our cognization, right? We have to be limited in terms of our ability to cognize something in order to even encounter something which exceeds that cognization. So we have to have limits, and the limit itself is the mask. Like the mask provides the limit, and the limit provides the mask. Actually, the limit provides the mask is more like really accurate, but we cannot even exist as a determinate thing. You can't be Javier without the whole Javier part, right? Like this, whatever I see here, you can't be the indeterminate potential interior to yourself. You can't be infinite without that finite boundary. And so the finite contains the saturated interiority, which is infinite. And so it's this beautiful interplay between what is infinite and what is not. And so the love of masks really being the love of the production of infinity within ourselves, the love of the indeterminate, which is sort of held together by the determinate form. Anyhow, how that relates to negative pragmatism, I'm not quite sure.
I think I have an example of art, at least when they talk about abstract art or modern art, people would say something like, well, a child could do it. And what I find interesting about it is, yes, a child could do it. The question is, would a child limit themselves to that restraint of a limit when creating art. That's what I would say, right? Because if a child wouldn't limit themselves or purposely constrain themselves, right? Like a child could make it. I wouldn't disagree with that, but it's the purposeful limitation within modern art, I think, which would be kind of resembling something like, I am creating, imposing this mask as to leave depth and profoundness, a sort of sense of indeterminacy to exist, versus trying to break the mask, which is trying to limit. But yeah, I'll be curious to think about
just
that.
to positivize that old, oh, my child could do this, or a child could do that art. What you're actually saying is someone who is highly limited, someone who is highly ignorant, could do that.
Yeah.
Now, per our conversation today, limits are entirely required to produce creativity itself. Like the creative act is an act of ignorance. It's an exploratory act. And then when we talk about, the indeterminate interiority, which is infinite and which is full of potential, again, we're talking about limits. And when we talked about the mask, we're talking about a limit. And so when you say only someone who is severely limited could make that, what you're actually saying is correct. Necessity is the mother of invention and so on. What you're actually paying is a really high compliment, is that the artist was somehow able to apply limitations on them to such an extent that you thought only someone who is naturally developmentally limited could even produce that. But instead, the artist was able to put limitations on them, whether they're constraints of time or constraints of technology, or constraints of information, or whatever they are, that produced in the consumer of the art a sensation that someone was working up against limits, up against limitation, which itself means, ironically, that they were working within the domain of creativity. So anyway, yeah. And again, it's again a negative, applying constraints is again a negative pragmatism. The idea that necessity is the mother of invention, where you're like, okay, sure, yeah, I get that when you don't have anything, but what happens when you do have everything as an artist? You got all the microphones, you got all the paintbrushes. How do you create necessity? Well, you can create it with time, you can rush, or you create it by just throwing away half your shit, or moving to the country and not bringing all of your stuff with you, and having to create stuff in a way that is limited, which is again a negative pragmatic way of literally subtracting from the accumulations of know-how and all the knowledge acquisition, all of the tools which were pragmatically assembled to optimize your process, removing them and creating a state of negative pragmatism, where you're forced to be in the space of invention again, by placing yourself in the space of necessity. So, yeah.
No, I like this because, and then we can cut this off. I like this because now it's like, it almost explains why we need negative pragmatism, because if the child is always used as a metaphor for creativity and so on, at least in Nietzsche, if the child is always naturally this limited being, then you could say as adults, in some sense, we have everything, right? We can come up with the solutions, we can come up with the processes to sort of surpass our limits. We can sort of almost do away with a sort of necessity, but then we get to that point, like you're talking about, where all of a sudden it actually involves a kind of restraint to be someone like a child. To be, I would say, even to do bad philosophy would be actually to embrace a sort of childlike nature, right? Right.
Yeah.
To do bad philosophy would be to be like a child.
Yeah, exactly.
Ironically, would be the creativity part, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
exactly.
yeah.
Be like a child. And of course, back to Nietzsche, that's the final state of spiritual development, is being like a child. So why not? Right? I mean,
Yeah.
talk about negative pragmatism. I mean, to be a child approaching philosophy is, pretty counterintuitive. But once you understand all of these things, it of course, the flip side, it becomes a pragmatic thing to do.
Yeah.
But anyhow, yeah, man. Yeah, it's a great topic. It really is. Yeah, and it's a great little phrase. It packs a punch. So yeah.
All right. With that being said, I'll just end the recording there.